thank you everybody for joining. Welcome to this very important, what is going to be a fascinating hour of conversation. Before I begin, of course, I'd just like to acknowledge that we are all coming to you from Aboriginal land, from stolen land that was never ceded. I'm here on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation in Redfern. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal people who are watching tonight, and of course Naomi, who is on our panel. We are in for a wonderful conversation over the next hour. Thank you so much for joining. Of course, the topic of the conversation tonight is 1.5 degrees, life beyond 1.5 degrees. This kind of came to us as an essential topic of conversation so soon, of course, after the terrible floods. This time it was in Hawkesbury, Nepean and the Hunter that we have seen on the East Coast, but so many different catastrophic coal and gas fueled events that we have seen over the last few years. And what is an increasing conversation between, I know, Greens members and supporters and everybody else who has understood that climate change is real and is getting worse, and that we should have acted on it a long time ago. The conversation is now, is it too late? Where to from here? What can we do to limit warming within, or heating within 1.5 degrees? And indeed, if it does overshoot, which it is looking incredibly likely for those of you who follow the politics and the climate science, it is looking rather frightening, actually, what 1.5 degrees looks like, if not 2 degrees. So we have a wonderful panel to talk about that, both from a what can we do to limit it, and then what are the stories that are emerging from around the globe of hope, but also, you know, what can we do as communities to work together and be resilient in what is obviously the biggest challenge that humanity has ever faced. And I think there's a lot of talk about keeping warming within 1.5 degrees, but there's not that much talk about what things look like beyond that. And I think clearly a lot of politicians have their heads in the sand on this. So I'm going to introduce our panel. So I'll just tell you how tonight is going to work. It's going to be a in conversation style event. I'll introduce our wonderful panel shortly, and I'll throw to them for opening questions. I have a range of questions to ask that could keep us going all night, but I know many of you will also have questions. So please use the Q&A box if you can, as opposed to the chat. And I will go, although you can chat amongst yourselves, but if you want a formal question asked of the panel, try and keep it into the Q&A box if you can. I'll be reading some of those out, and of course we'll try and answer as we go. We might be able to answer, we will be able to answer some live, and might see what we can put in to the chat as well. So without further ado, I was very excited when we were first talking about who to have for this discussion. The three, thinking of Christine and Scott and Naomi, kind of came very quickly. I've worked with Naomi quite recently as a result of the Lismore floods. So I'm going to throw to Naomi first, and I'll introduce Naomi, who is an incredibly inspirational woman who has been really representing her community and a champion for her community for a long time, but particularly since the horrendous floods in up north. So Naomi Moran is a Nyangbal, Arakwal and Dunghutti woman from New South Wales. She's a general manager of Australia's only independent Indigenous newspaper, the Courier Mail. She's one of many who has really become the human face of the climate emergency. Hours before, in fact, no, I'll let Naomi tell you the story of what she did with her community. Then next we have Christine Milne, and for those of you who have joined and know the Greens and love the Greens, you know and love Christine. So Christine is the former leader of the Australian Greens. For decades, Christine has worked for some of the world's great wild places, but it was when she was appointed to Australia's first ever Greenhouse Gas Council in 1990, that's very depressing, that she realised the true extent of the threat of climate change. Her career in the federal parliament was focused on driving action on global warming. We know and thank Christine for her huge involvement, her pivotal role in developing the 2012 clean energy package. And I will ask, and she retired from the parliament in 2015, and now she's an ambassador for the Global Greens, and she was appointed as an officer of the Order of Australia in 2018. And we'll talk a little bit about the federal politics in relation to what's happening this week, actually, in Parliament, if anyone wants to comment on that later. And then Scott Ludlam, who as well, all of you, the same thing I'll say as well, if you know and love the Greens, you know and love Scott, former Australian Greens Senator from 2018 to 2017, and he served as a deputy leader of the Australian Greens. Scott's also worked as a filmmaker, artist and graphic designer. Perhaps what's extremely relevant for tonight is Scott has just written a book called Full Circle, A Search for the World That Comes Next. And I won't read kind of everything about the book, but I'll just read one kind of endorsement or review, if you like, from Bill McKibben, who we all know, or the climate activists know and love, author of The End of Nature. And he says, Scott Ludlam's Full Circle ranges very far in space and time. The story stretches over hundreds of millions of years in every inch of our planet. Ludlam's insights are often cogent and deep, and more than that, they're earned. His willingness to engage in the fight he's describing gives his take on these existential questions real power. And then one other sentence from Raj Patel, who is just a wonderful author, and I just love this sentence. Australia lost a senator. Yes, we did. The world gained a luminous writer. So that is looking forward to hearing Scott's insights, because from his book and all of the stories and people and discussions he's had. So let's get to it. I've talked enough. Naomi, so what have you learned? So you've basically been on the front line of the climate emergency. We are going to see a hell of a lot of other extreme events. These are really catastrophic, violent events that your community witnessed. Can you tell us about your experience within the community, but particularly in terms of your First Nations community in providing the knowledge and the leadership in that instance and what that looks like going forward?
Yeah, thank you. Dingiwala, everyone. Thank you so much for having me share in tonight's webinar. Certainly not an easy thing to have conversations around the recent events. It's still quite, heavy on everybody in the community here, but it's certainly important to have conversations that continue to raise the issues on what our communities are experiencing and what we know is a result of severe neglect for what we know are the reasons why this continues to happen, not just in our communities, but around the nation and around the globe. Unfortunately, we're still very much in the thick of relief and recovery here in Lismore for our communities, and certainly the Koori Mail as an organisation and our community of volunteers, our wonderful community of volunteers and supporters are still on the ground supporting our community the best way that we can. I think, when you ask that question, what have you learned? Certainly as a newspaper, naturally and organically falling into the role of providing care and relief for our communities. We've learned a lot, and we often say and have said over the past, 4 or 5 months now is that this is certainly not our day job, but I guess the foundations of the Koori Mail, what the Koori Mail stands for in terms of being a 100% Aboriginal owned organisation and a grassroots community organisation from the community for the community. Those particular foundations and pillars of strength as an organisation and business has certainly supported how we took on the responsibility to look after our communities in those first few days following the major flood, and then certainly how we were able to support the wider community through the resources that we were able to get on the ground. And a lot of that came from engaging with communities and networks and contacts that we have as an organisation and business. That certainly helped. But I must speak very highly of the cultural responsibility that our community had during that time and still now to support our communities, not just our Indigenous communities, but the cultural responsibility that our Bundjalung Nation and communities has to make sure that we, not only provide relief and support for people affected by the floods, but are now very much part of the conversations around how to protect and care for our lands and our waterways and our river systems moving forward.
Thank you so much, Naomi. I'll go straight to Christine now. Christine, you oversaw Australia's strongest period of carbon emissions reductions following the introduction of the carbon price, and now you work across the global Greens movement. What's our best hope for keeping warming below 1.5 degrees? How is Australia looking? How is the globe looking? What's your take on that? And you're muted just to, yeah.
Thanks, Kate. And no, we didn't colour coordinate. Look, it's great to be talking about this, but it's rather depressing because the reality is we are on track not just for 2 degrees, but actually for 3 degrees and more. That is the fact. You look at what the pledges are around the world, and that's what it comes to. The unfortunate thing is that the global community goes along to the conferences of the parties every year. They make all kinds of pledges every year. They run away from legally binding agreements, and they come home and do as they intended to do anyway, because we don't have integrity in the political system anymore, because, and I would argue that we are a plutocracy in Australia, not a democracy, because parliaments are owned by the fossil fuel sector. So that's very depressing. What can we do about it? Well, we can just stop burning things. The fundamental bottom line is stop burning coal, stop burning gas, stop cutting down and burning forests. That would be a great way to start. So the problem we have is that governments everywhere want to say that they recognise as a global emergency, but then everything they do says, in fact, they don't regard it as a global emergency, that it's a dawdle, that as long as they can facilitate business as usual with slight modification on the side, it will be fine. Well, it won't be fine, and that's the situation we are in now. So I think the biggest challenge, if we were to get really serious, is for people to accept that we are in a climate emergency. We're in a biodiversity emergency as well, in the middle of an extinction crisis. And that means you go into emergency mode. Just as we did with COVID, it requires that kind of an immediate shift in everything that we do. And that means that we really don't have the time for market mechanisms in the way that we did have. I would argue in the decade up to 2010, we could have, as Sir Nicholas Stern said, we could have actually gone quite hard and given ourselves a chance. Because we went so slowly, we've run out of time. So I think the fundamental shift is stop burning things and get over the notion that we're going to have a market-based corporate kind of mechanism. We're not. We have to go to regulation, just as we did with the COVID emergency, just as you do when you go into a war situation. It's a matter of government saying, right, well, that's it. This is the timetable. We're going to move to electric vehicles. We're going to phase out coal-fired power, and here's the timeline. This is where we're ending native forest logging. This is the timeline, and actually get into that. And I just don't see the courage for that in the current political system, which just says to me that there is no real acceptance that there's an emergency for all the talk, Kate.
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, absolutely. Where is the urgency? That's exactly right, even now with the new government. Scott, so one way or another, so Christine has talked about the really terrible potential of 2 to 3 degrees warming, and many of us whose inboxes are flooded with the climate science and what have you probably agree with that. So one way or another, we know we're headed for radical change. You've been researching what others are doing around the world to pivot our thinking towards regeneration, climate safety, Would you just kind of, explain to us a little bit about the work you've been doing in researching your book to begin with?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kate. And thanks everybody for being here. It's a really wonderful turnout, which is awesome. So I'm speaking from the traditional country of the Jurunganj people of the Yuin Nation, south coast of New South Wales. I can say on New Year's Eve 2019-20, at 1.3 degrees of warming, when we had a mega fire sweep through and wipe out the main street of Cobargo as part of the mega fires that hit the East Coast over that black summer, that we don't need to wait for 1.5 degrees to understand just how much in harm's way we are. And so I feel one of the things that I wanted to say, and it's very evident in my travels, but also here at home, is that the climate itself is now a political actor. Not to take away from any of the exceptional organising prowess of our comrades and colleagues in Brisbane in the last federal election, but I don't think it's a coincidence that having half the Brisbane CBD underwater in those horrific floods that hit the northern rivers in southeast Queensland, and then a month later hit them again, I think that has an impact in people's voting intentions that's more persuasive than any bullshit fossil fuel ad campaign or the companies sponsoring our local footy team. Around the world, I guess, in researching Full Circle, the purpose of that, I suppose, was to deal with some of the psychic bruising that occurred and that I know Christine shared from watching the fossil fuel industry and its proxies in Parliament knock over the best chance that we had in 2013 to keep the carbon price intact. Not just the price itself as the market mechanism, but all the regulatory instruments that surrounded it. That was paying for the biodiversity restoration, that was paying for people on low income so they weren't hit by the price rises, and that was paying for clean energy. It's important to know, actually, that those parts of the package are still there. We were able to protect those. But it hit hard. I know this is a little bit of jargon. It hit hard the old theory of change. If we vote, if we pass laws, if we regulate, isn't that meant to be the way forward? And then you watch an exercise of what I've started calling state capture, and you can see this literature and this experience being reflected in the literature and in activist communities around the world, where powerful industries, it's nuclear industry in Japan, it's the financial sector and the media sector and comms in the United States, here it's the resources sector, they bankroll both the major parties. And so that's partly, it's why it's so important that the Greens are a really powerful presence and that the rise of the independents and the Greens in opening up that crossbench wedge. But also it's becoming very difficult to see how we change the government. Like I've just returned from Western Australia. It's practically a one-party state.
Yeah.
I don't know what our electoral path is in Western Australia under the purest form of state capture where industry pays for both sides and the kind of fusion of mainstream political parties with industry lobbyists where they're just basically crossing back and forth between offices, making a fortune along the way. So that's a couple of factors. Firstly, the weather itself, the climate's now a political actor. Secondly, we're dealing with this campaign under a regime of straight state capture, which I think forces us to reevaluate not just the role of the Greens as an activist political formation, but also how we support other civil society actors in hitting this industry from every direction. And I think also recognising that what we're in, the industry may not read Greens press releases, but they sure as hell read what the International Energy Agency says, which is we have to leave about 80% of the presently established fossil fuel reserves underground. So we are seeing a stampede at the moment to see who can be the 20%, like who gets their stuff out of the ground as opposed to who is left without a chair when the music stops. And that's why there's this full-on stampede at the moment. And I think we're in a very dangerous place indeed, because we've got Labor over the Pacific Islands Forum signing on to a climate emergency declaration while signing off on a carbon bomb at Scarborough and Browse on the Burrup Peninsula, where I've just come back from, which in my mind is actually more dangerous because it's a tranquilizing rhetoric. At least with Tony Abbott, you knew who your enemy was. Morrison brought a lump of coal into the parliament. Albanese won't do that, but the signature on the piece of paper to open up these new fossil fuel basins will be the same. So I know we've got an hour together to talk about what we do about it. I just feel it's worth framing. This is about the last time we get to have a conversation about 1.5 degrees. Come back in 2 or 3 years, it'll sound ridiculous. So we have to seize these opportunities that are in front of us now. Thanks for creating the space as well, Kate, for the conversation to be had.
Nice one. Thanks, Scott. That's excellent. So let's stick with Labor, what Labor are doing federally to begin with, because we're kind of still within this Can we keep it within 1.5 degrees? So right now there's, the media's interviewing Labor around the carbon reduction target that they took to the federal election, which is 43% by 2030. There's conversations around whether it's a floor. We don't want it to be a ceiling. I think Adam Ban has come out and said it can't be a ceiling, it's got to be a floor. Of course, lots of chatter around the fact that, well, they're going to meet that anyway, and we need to be as ambitious as possible, and they're not coming to what the science is saying. So, Christine, with your experience, of course, in really leading the Greens throughout 2012 when all of this was taking place, what are your thoughts around where Labor's at the moment, what they're saying publicly? Do you think that there could be a situation where they're doing things differently behind closed doors, or do you think, no, it's 43%, they're not going to really be any more ambitious than that for a while, and they're too close to the fossil fuel industry, which I think we know the answer to that anyway?
I don't think they are going to do anything other than what they have said, and that is 43%, because where did that number come from? Now, so let's just, if they were serious about the science, then the Climate Council has said, 75% emissions reduction is what is necessary to get us to our fair share in a global context, and to try and give ourselves a shot of less than 2 degrees and pursuing 1.5. So where did this 43% come from? And I can only assume that is the figure that's been agreed with the fossil fuel industry that they will wear. That's all. There is no science, and Chris Bowen and no one can explain what are the assumptions that were fed into any model or whatever that got us to 43%. It's a meaningless number. But I heard Jim Chalmers, saying, oh, but it's going to reassure people, it's going to give business certainty and so on. It's going to give them certainty that they're not going to do any more than that. That is the agreed position that they've reached. Also, what Labor has done is to recognise that the climate movement essentially was an energy movement, a transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy in the electricity and energy sector. It has not been a comprehensive movement from the environment, which includes biodiversity and which includes the whole plethora of everything that we need to address. And so Labor has come out and said, look, we are going to pursue 82% transition in the renewable energy sector. We're going to do something about electric cars. We're going to do that. And people think, oh, that's great. We're dealing with the electricity sector, but that is only 1% of the greenhouse gas emissions. Meanwhile, native forest logging is going on around the country. There is a big push for biomass, logging native forests to burn them for biomass energy, and that is being encouraged and subsidised, I might add. And then you have signing off, as Scott just said, on Beetaloo and Browse Scarborough and Browse and Beetaloo in the Northern Territory, Narrabri and so on. So you simply can't say that you're serious about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and set a target of 43% when all that's going on. At the same time, just because of the transition in the electricity sector, some coal-fired power stations are going to fall over in this period of government. There is no accommodation in this target to say that every time a major emitter falls over, we're going to increase the target by the corresponding amount. Nothing like that. All it's going to do is enable to create the space within the 43% to sign off on more coal and gas. And then finally, doing exactly what Rudd did in 2009, which is we'll achieve it with offsets. We'll achieve it by buying cheap offsets. And this is where I come back to this idea. If you actually took climate as a comprehensive thing and understood the biosphere, then you simply cannot offset new and additional fossil fuel emissions going to atmosphere now with the idea that sometime in the future, the forests might absorb it. Because by the time, first of all, you can't compare the two. But secondly, the rate things are going, you are losing so much of biodiversity. that it will start that's feeding more carbon into the atmosphere. So my view is it's disingenuous. It's absolutely disingenuous. And what is even more disingenuous is all the people who keep saying you've got to start somewhere. Well, all it's essentially saying is, let's actually approach the cliff slightly slower, but knowing that we're going to go over.
Yeah.
Let's all just go over the cliff, but just buy ourselves a bit more time till the next electoral cycle so that we can fall over the cliff then.
So I wanted to just touch on, you mentioned biodiversity, Christine, and the need in native forests and everything. Naomi, I want to go to you, and this comes into, there's a question, and thank you everybody, your questions are pouring in and they're awesome, and we'll try to get as many as we get to as many as we can. So Judith Gamper on Ngunnawal Ngambri country, and it's talking about the NITV screened We Have to Talk About Fire during NAIDOC. Excellent documentary. I know we're running out of time, but we must support First Nations people to heal country. How can we be stronger to do this? And I wanted to just get your comments on that, Naomi, but also around, I suppose, seeing the devastating floods, and whether you wanted to comment around any of the environmental destruction or whatever that has occurred in the lead up to the floods that may have made it worse. I don't know whether you're able to comment in that way, but in what role can First Nations communities play? How can we assist First Nations communities in terms of healing country going forward?
Yeah, I think, and I mean, look, we've obviously had conversations within our own community groups and with our own, families and networks here around acknowledging what our cultural responsibility is as Aboriginal people, not just in this region, but around the nation in terms of caring for country. Now, that certainly looks different and has looked different and been different to what, corporate responsibility looks like in this country, and what I guess white Australians think their responsibility looks like in this country. And that we really have to acknowledge that it cannot be tokenistic anymore. It cannot be surface level. It cannot be about lip service, and it cannot be about ticking boxes here. This is about aligning what you feel your responsibility should look like with what our cultural responsibility looks like as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That is the difference. And that takes a lot of deep listening, connecting to country, connecting to community, to understand what we feel is right in terms of how we do heal country. Every move that this nation makes to address climate change has to have an Indigenous lens. Absolutely. And I'd be extremely ignorant to continue to do otherwise moving forward, not just after the recent events, but obviously, after many, many years of us having the same conversations and sitting around the same round tables and having, the same forums. And I think that, now's the time to make sure that every single move this country makes in terms of, climate crisis and emergencies and how to move forward, it's about that cultural responsibility. What does that look like now? And I mean, even locally here in this LGA, it's certainly about every move that Lismore makes, that this region makes to repair and recover from this flood. Certainly needs to have conversations and input by our local communities. And I know, relatives of mine have spoken about our river systems and how important that local knowledge is to understand our local river systems in this region, and how we can prevent this, tragedy from happening again. What's the work that literally needs to be done on the ground here? And I'm not talking about, these ongoing conversations and meetings and talk. This is actually about putting your feet on the ground and making sure that we repair it properly to support this region should this happen again. Conversations around, well, what did the vegetation linings look like on our rivers, prior to colonisation? Those facts, those actual facts around what supported the rising river levels in this region during those early days, that was because our people knew exactly what needed to happen on this country and on this land. And I think, like I said, everything has to have a black lens here. We have to pay attention to what our local Indigenous knowledges are around supporting how we can protect and care for country. Now, we know how to do that within our own mob and our own communities. It's about everybody else now understanding how important this is.
Thanks, Naomi, because you were when I went to Lismore, I couldn't get there for a few weeks, and I was there a few weeks later, and I ended up chatting with you about going to the Courier Mail and having a quick conversation with you then. And I've chaired the, not chaired, sorry, I was on the floods inquiry as well, the Upper House floods inquiry, and you presented to that too. And what is really stark is how quickly you had mobilized the resources as much as you could. You had the knowledge, in the advanced knowledge, really. I don't think much of the rest of the community really had the knowledge that you had. People were relying on the Bureau of Meteorology and the SES, and kind of like it was also a failed system, if you like. But you said you were there the night before, I think, the floods, ready to go, and had started mobilizing resources to protect, firstly, your mob first, which of course you talk about why that was the case, which is complete. And then the Courier Mail, all of your resources also pivoted to providing this amazing space for everybody else as well. So how were you there straight away? I mean, even that is, in terms of the lessons that we can learn around what needs to be done for future circumstances like this.
Yeah, I think, look, on that leading up to the flood event, obviously, just like everybody else, trying to take in as much information as we could from the local SES and emergency services, but also, that local knowledge of, we have been through floods before. I came back into my role as General Manager of Courier Mail in 2016. We then had a major flood in 2017, and I was there the night before, the levee overtopped, and had to, got orders from the SES to go because I refused to unplug everything. We're a newspaper, we had a deadline. So, going back to that time and understanding the levels that were coming into our region, so for us, locally, I think everybody was as prepared and had as much information and knowledge about what was going to happen as we were told. I think what we really focused on doing was understanding that, and I guess the reality that this was going to be bigger than the last one. Now, what that meant for us was our communities, our Indigenous communities that are placed on the outskirts of these regions, not just the ones in 2017 that were affected, that this is actually going to spread even further, not necessarily being inundated with water, but being cut off by the waters, so that there was absolutely a need to plan. And I guess, look, I can honestly tell you it completely happened naturally and organically. I guess as an Aboriginal organisation, our priority within those first few days was connecting with our communities and making sure that we had contact points in those communities from the get-go. So basically coming up with a strategy ourselves to make sure that our remote communities were supported. And I guess once we felt we were comfortable that they were getting everything that they needed, then absolutely we were able to assist the rest of the community the best way that we know how. But again, it does come down to, having that local knowledge around experiencing these weather events before. And I think this is very much part of the conversations, not just the Indigenous voice, but the wider community here around these inquiries and around these forums. Is local knowledge is so important. I certainly don't speak on behalf of the entire community. I can only share my experiences and the experiences of the Courier Mail, but certainly local knowledge from an entire region is so important to how we move forward.
Thank you. That's awesome. Let's and we'll need to also ask questions about beyond 1.5 in terms of how we community stories and stories of hope. That's coming up. I look like I'm about to go to a break, sound like I'm about to go to a break, but we're not going to a break. We are going to talk, because there's quite a few comments and questions around, of course, the need to end coal and gas. People are talking, there's quite a few of you that have asked this question. This is a political question, it's a campaigns question. Scott, I might go to you first, then Christine. Lots of everyone saying that's what we have to do, and what can we do from here on in to make sure that happens as best as we can make it happen.
Do you want me to have a crack at that one?
Yeah, go for it. Yes.
I'm just having a quick squeeze because the chat window has been extremely busy and fantastic.
It's so busy. Yeah, there's quite a few questions. Yeah. Keith Osborne, agree science-based targets are important to negotiate, but would it be more effective, to push for no new coal and gas? And there's a bunch on that. So let's go there.
There's one as well in terms of a question of what is the best way to challenge this if keeping the stuff in the ground is really our only hope of survival? Like, how do we do that? What are the various ways of doing that? I might just do a really quick screen share, if that's all right, just for a second, to maybe help kick that conversation along.
Excellent. We love a screen share.
Well, I don't always love it because often it's just a debacle, but let's see.
It's working.
All right, great. So you're kind of thinking about putting this industry in our sights, the fossil fuel industry, because that's what's driving this. That's what's in charge. It's not governments, and that's really what state capture tells us. Then it's worth asking, well, what are the pillars of support? What's holding the fossil fuel sector up? Gas and coal are a little bit dissimilar. They have separate customer bases, different production processes and so on, but just glob them together for a moment. The primary thing that they need is land, stolen land in this colony, access to the resource from which to rip the resources out and sell it. So working our way around the different pillars of support, they need land, they need labour, they need workforces and compliant workers to build and maintain and operate these plants. They need capital, they need banking, finance, insurance, auditors, all the kind of money people, which is driving the entire system. At the top of the diagram, they need customers, which is why I think they're freaking out so much about the renewable revolution, because their customer base is evaporating before their eyes. They require social license, and so there's this very active infrastructure of maintaining social license of this industry doing enormous harm. Media, lobbyists, the peak bodies, all the little creepy crawlies who basically manipulate public opinion and political opinion to keep this thing viable. And then you've got government, which as Greens is kind of where we tend to focus, is like the apparatus of the state, the public sector, the courts, and so on. If that's so far so good. The state capture sectors are the three that are marked in red there mostly, right? The nexus between industry, these different entities that produce and maintain social license, and the state. When you pop each of these ones open, you'll see that within each of those, there's all these various actors. So within labour, there's the engineering companies, there's the unions who represent the workers, there's the labour hire people, and so on. So you can see like this industry requires this very complex and synchronized, thousands of different people and entities in order to maintain smooth production. And so what we tend to do, firstly, reminding ourselves that it also relies on a stable climate. The oil and gas industry and the coal industry has been hit by these climate disasters that it's provoking just as much as the rest of society. And that also is tilting the politics. But what we have to remind ourselves is that there's no one answer. If we knew how to do this, we'd have done it in the 1990s. We've been quite successfully checkmated at every turn. As you said at the outset, or as Christine said at the outset, we all send delegations to these climate, these conferences of the parties that have been occurring every year since 1992. They come back basically with these agreements, and the CO2 curve keeps inclining upwards. So what we do as a social movement, there's the Greens down in the bottom right with the parliamentary interventions and running elections, getting people elected and cracking the state capture nexus open. But think about social movements as an ecosystem. We are everywhere. There are people getting board resolutions up within Woodside that are rolling the board and getting people kicked off the board. We've got engagement with the staff. We've got blockades and direct action, Extinction Rebellion, or actions on site up at the Carmichael mine, up at the Burrup Peninsula and elsewhere. So you can kind of get a sense that the social movement is composed of all of these things. We don't all have to agree on timing or tactics, but I think we do have to respect that from now on until we fix this thing, it's a full court press. It's everything we have. Be creative, try stuff we haven't tried before, and just respect the multitude of tactics. I think we need to be better coordinated, obviously, but just respect that everybody is out there pressing on. And if you haven't found your place, find a group. Get in touch with XR, get in touch with the Greens, get in touch with ACCR if you're a shareholder in some of these companies, and get into the fight in whatever way you like. There's no right way to do this.
Thanks, Scott. ACCR acronym is
the Australasian Centre for Corporate Social Responsibility.
Excellent.
So they basically buy shareholdings, or they aggregate investors who've got shareholdings in these big oil and gas companies, and they lobby internally in language that these folk understand about, well, how are you going to be compliant with the Paris targets? How are we going to get our money back in the 2030s if you've burnt the world down? And it's increasingly effective. Now, that's different to running a street protest. But it's, that money is one of the things that they obviously pay attention to. So we have to hit them wherever it hurts, whether it's inside our comfort zone or not.
Yes, and some people are in the questions are actually talking about making. Michael Organ has just posted, "Hey Michael, isn't the only way to shut down the fossil fuel industry making it financially unviable or unprofitable? How can this be done by making renewables more profitable and genuine, reliable alternatives?" I'll throw to you in a sec, Christine, and also as in now, I'll throw to you now. But also, could you just give your views around the New South Wales government's legislation where basically climate protest is now, if they blockade certain infrastructure, certain, can be thrown into jail for 2 years or fined $22,000. And of course, we've got some activists that are facing some really scary crap right now as a result of, doing in like what we as Greens MPs in the New South Wales Parliament have said, thank you very much for doing this, and just wondering what your thoughts are on that as well. But lots of people wanting to know what we can do in terms of fossil fuels. It's 11:10. I know we've got to get to future stuff around resilience too.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Cate. And first of all, on the anti-protest laws, it's not just New South Wales. Victoria has moved on it too, as has Tasmania. This is a coordinated effort by the fossil fuel and logging industry to shut down protest and criminalise protest in a democracy. So that comes to the importance of the integrity of our democracy. If we are going to make this shift and do it fast enough, we have to be a genuinely democratic society, not one that is, as Scott pointed out, suffering from state capture. And I would argue that those anti-protest laws are state capture, absolutely driven for one purpose only, and that is to shut down the protest movement. So I've been thinking about this a lot as to how we overcome it. And I was very impressed by the Pacific Island leaders who came out very strongly saying that Australia is not doing enough. And Australia, of course, is desperately trying to get the Pacific Island leaders to back the Labor government in trying to hold a climate COP in Australia in the next couple of years. And I thought, well, how the hell is that going to work? Because every part of a climate COP is a huge protest movement. Thousands of protesters, ENGOs fly in from wherever and have big climate marches and protests. And I thought, why on earth would Australia be inviting a climate COP knowing that thousands of people are going to be protesting everywhere from Scarborough into Darwin, into Narrabri, into wherever? And clearly these protest laws are part of it. So it occurred to me we should be actually talking to the Pacific Island leaders, asking them to say that, they won't support Australia in hosting a COP unless Australia removes all of its anti-protest laws to enable the community to participate in the way that they can. Which also brings me to Antonio Guterres coming out saying, don't work for climate wreckers. Excellent. He has also said it's madness to be taking more fossil fuel resources right now. So if Australia wants to make itself a target in terms of global opinion, fine, good. Let's actually go for it and mobilise other countries to start putting pressure on Australia about these anti-democratic laws that they've introduced to protect the fossil fuel industry. So I think the best way, we've always won campaigns in Australia by taking them overseas and bringing them home. And I think that on this particular issue of the protest laws, we have a good chance of taking the protest overseas and getting enough pressure on Australia to actually wind them back. So I think that's one strategy that we could use. And I would encourage people to start writing to the UN and saying that, what Australia is doing is to protect the fossil fuel industry, and contrary to what Australia is saying about being asking to be taken back globally, we're back. Yeah, we're back, shutting down protest and taking out fossil fuels faster than ever. That should be the message to the global community.
Thanks, Christine. And Naomi, I think First Nations communities in Australia, given what Christine was just saying about the Pacific, potentially, bringing COP to the Pacific or here, that would be something that our First Nations people should be leading ideally, and being at the very start of that process, and just wondering whether, what you think about that, whether from your perspective in terms of First Nations peoples working with people in the Pacific, how important that is, and showing leadership there would be a wonderful thing. Maybe it's happening already in terms of for a COP in Australia, particularly, whether you've got any views on that.
I think what we need to, really acknowledge is that within, cultured groups, so, within our Indigenous communities and Indigenous people in Australia, the conversations, across to other Pacific Island nations, they've always happened. They've been happening for years, because it's a common thread. It's something that, our people, whether it's here in Australia or in the islands, have experienced. And that certainly comes from, I guess, connecting in terms of, colonised nations and colonised groups of people. So these conversations have always been had. What's missing, though, is the leaders, the people who are responsible for making these key decisions, for our country, coming in on those conversations and listening deeply to those conversations. So it continues to blow my mind that, and I've said this before, and I said it that day I spoke at the inquiry, we're still sitting around talking about how can we resolve these issues? What are the answers? We've got over 230 years of conversations that have been happening within our own Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So who's not listening, or who's not taking action where it needs to be? And it's certainly now about time that people came to the table of our communities to understand, like you said, just how much we could potentially, or we know is our rightful place to take the lead in these conversations.
Thank you, Naomi. I wanted to move to the kind of moving forward around mitigation, adaptation, what we're doing in terms of resilient communities, cities, what have you. And there's a few issues to explore here. I'll go to a question from Danielle Wheeler. Hi, Danielle, thanks for joining, who lives in the Hawkesbury. We've just had our fourth flood. In fact, Danielle's a Hawkesbury councillor. We've just had our fourth flood, the first of which put out the Gospers Mountain mega fire, which burned for 4 months. How do we move beyond bullshit mitigation projects into a proper discussion about suitable land use? And of course, Naomi, this is what the Lismore community is talking about, every day, really. I'll throw to you first for this one. What's your view? How do we kind of move? What do we do? How do we move beyond that? I know Lismore's talking about it's, the levy and bigger this and bigger that, but surely at some point we've got to talk about what suitable land use is, which is starting to happen with land swaps.
Yeah, and I was just going through some of the questions, and somebody mentioned, the most obvious thing was that, being told not to build there in the first place. Now, obviously, we can't turn back time, and unfortunately, this is a result of that, ongoing ignorance around land and the importance of Black voices when it comes to infrastructure on land and destroying land. And I think obviously too late now to go back, but what we can do now is make sure that the conversations around how to move forward, how to make use of land, what that looks like, is very much about who that looks like. And I cannot stress this enough that I can honestly say that over the past 4 months, the amount of invitations I've personally had to come in on conversations, I've probably been, if not the only Indigenous person in the room, or one of very many in the room. And I cannot, explain just how frustrating that is to look around and go, where is the responsibility to make sure that you're connecting to community and connecting to country? And one of the other comments in the chats around, even local Indigenous knowledge or local knowledges couldn't have prepared us for what had happened in February, and I absolutely agree. But this is also about the ongoing, ignorance to the conversation and who the right people are to be leading those conversations. The answers are there, and I think the really important practical and culturally responsible strategies are there. They're just not being heard, and look, I could talk on it for a lot longer than this, but it's about letting people who know how to contribute in the most practical way to make sure that country is being looked after. Those are the people that need to be, around the tables now.
Thanks, Naomi. Christian, I'm going to go to you in relation to this. So how do we have conversations with people and communities about the fact that there are some places that people may need to stop living in altogether in relation to, well, there are, we know that, managed retreat. What's your views on, I mean, clearly we need to be talking about it. We're terrible at it. It's a tricky conversation. What's your views on that?
We absolutely need to be talking about managed retreat, and the only reason we're not is the most expensive real estate in Australia is the most vulnerable. So the richest people own the biggest mansions about to fall into the sea on many, sandy beaches effectively. But, we're getting to the point where the insurance industry is going to make the decisions for us if we don't actually make them as a community. Because the insurance industry is just going to refuse to insure people in various places or make the premiums so high and so extreme that people can't pay them. And then when the next fire or the next flood comes through, the people have got no option but to move and can't rebuild anyway because they can't claim insurance. Back in 2009 or 10, I was in the Senate and I wrote to every local government in Australia, because I didn't want anyone in the future to be able to say, nobody told us, we didn't know. And what I said then was that when the insurance industry won't pay, people will sue the local council for having given them planning permission to build on a floodplain or build on a vulnerable coastal flat or estuary or wherever it is, even though they will have begged the council to give them planning permission at the time. They'll be able to sue them to say, you gave me planning permission to build here when you knew, when all the flood profiles said at the time that it would flood or that it would burn. And that means that the ratepayers have to pay. So the way to have these conversations is to say either we plan for this now, or we are all going to pay, because again, the richest people live on the most expensive real estate in the most vulnerable areas, and they're the ones who want the seawalls. They're the ones who want the community to step up and spend a fortune protecting the real estate that they shouldn't have had there in the first place. So communities need to understand that they'll be the ones who ultimately have to pay unless we get real about proper planning. So the first thing is, whether it's local government or state government in charge of planning, they have to immediately change their planning laws to not allow people to be building on floodplains and vulnerable areas. Second thing is there has to be a mechanism to buy places back. The government is going to have to step in and buy places back, because people have to be enabled to move. And the only way that's going to happen is if governments say, look, we're going to buy your house back. You can live in it for as long as you can, but when the flood comes or whatever, and it washes away, then we've bought back the house and you've got this amount of money to move somewhere else. In the UK, they've already had these discussions right along the south coast, because they're not only having sea level rise, but they're sinking as well. So it's double the impact. And they've had community meetings everywhere saying, okay, we're going to protect these places. We're going to let these places go. I think Lismore is clearly an example of where people have to start talking about whether it's realistic given what's locked in with global warming and already the history of flooding in Lismore, that it was already vulnerable. Do we move Lismore? And if we did, what could we do to demonstrate what a city of the future might look like? So why wouldn't we go in and build a totally electric city that was powered by renewable energy, which is a 15-minute city, so that it's full of public transport and walkways and cycleways, and actually consider building, so whoever goes first, if you like the stick and the carrot, whichever community decides to go first gets the opportunity to build a genuine city of the future starting from scratch. But I do think it has to be both stick and incentives. But we have to get over this idea that just because a wealthy person has a place in a piece of real estate or a building, that they should somehow be then subsidised by the community to try to protect it in an unrealistic way.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to point out in the chats as well, agree that the coastal kind of inundation stuff is often, of course, those wealthier beachfront properties, but with flooding, often it's the low-lying, poorer communities that are most heavily impacted. I wanted to go to you, Scott, and also just to get a sense of whether, like, what stories did you kind of gather in terms of your book, you know, stories of hope, what are people doing in terms of, you know, regeneration, and planning for the future and planning for future extreme weather events. Have you got anything there? And Christian, I'll go to you as well, because I know there's one for you on this too.
Yeah, a couple of things came through really strongly, and one was that industry has a relatively narrow repertoire. It's got an amazingly restricted playbook, and it will abuse given host community as much as you let them. I spent a bit of time in Mongolia with the Mongolian Greens, who were gearing up for an election at that time in coalition with a heap of other parties, and we're talking to people who I got to meet their former prime minister, resource super profits tax, and was rolled by the mining sector. And no prime minister had set out a full term in the last, you know, decade and a half at the time that I was there. Drought was wiping the place out. The resources sector was running rampant. Some of them were companies that we knew that were based in Australia, and everything felt incredibly familiar. Whether it's in Minas Gerais in Brazil, where BHP was partly responsible for the collapse of a tailings dam that wiped out villages, polluted 500 kilometres of river, Mongolia, Jharkhand in India, or up in the Pilbara, these companies will take as much as we let them take. And in the context of the climate emergency, one of the things that came through really strongly is that there's no nationalist way out of this. This is either an internationalist social movement that builds that cross-border solidarity with people doing similar work to what we do under really adverse and risky circumstances sometimes. Either we do this together as a planetary society, or we're going to end up in in the extreme end of it in forms of eco-fascism, where you end up with kind of green nationalism that can branch into eco-fascism if it's fully expressed, where we end up where the climate debate ends up being hijacked by people who will use it as a way of demonizing climate refugees, for example. So I think internationalizing the movement is a really key part of it. I suspect Christine's got a fair bit to say about that too.
Thanks, Scott. And I'll throw to yes, Christine, because I in this same kind of breadth, recognizing that we'll probably extend say 5 or 10 minutes after 7:30, if that's because everyone is on and the questions are just coming in like crazy. Yeah, if you wanted to talk about that, but also we had an interesting chat before we went live around the fact that you've teamed up to teach architecture, which is amazing, to master students at the University of Tasmania, focusing on the Pacific, and that's really exciting what you were saying then as well in terms of the story of hope.
Well, the first good news thing is that the Greens, we are a global political party. We are the only global political party at this time in terms of a climate and global emergency, and we are a global political party with global reach. That means that we can talk to our colleagues all over the world and give them input and vice versa. So, for example, Grace O'Sullivan, a terrific Irish MEP, she negotiates for the European Parliament with the European Commission. She's been running a full-on campaign against them recognising gas and nuclear as part of renewables for the purpose of the next period of the climate commission, the EU Commission. We need to be supporting her. I've been communicating with Carolyn Lucas in the UK about the fact that Twiggy Forrest wants to dam the Congo to generate renewable energy to produce green hydrogen for export into Europe. Now, there's no way that's green hydrogen when you're displacing thousands of people in the Congo and destroying forests. So it's that issue of we need to let people on the other side of the world know when it's one of our companies running rampant, and equally we need people in those countries to let us know when things are going wrong so that we can raise them in our parliaments. And I think that's one of the most effective things, that Greens MPs can support each other around the world and talk in various parliaments. So I think the Greens, the Global Greens, offers us a fantastic opportunity to actually, as Scott has just talked about, be the global activists in the political realm, and that's already being played out. We've got, you know, we're in government in 6 or 7 countries in Europe, which a lot of Greens don't realise. We've got climate change ministers everywhere, from New Zealand to Ireland. They're doing amazing things on transport. They're doing great things on city planning. That gives me great hope that we can all learn from each other and support each other. In terms of the Pacific, I've been desperately concerned about sea level rise and the fact that we are forcing people to leave their communities because there's no fresh water, land scarcity, storm surge, everything we know about that. And so here in Hobart, we have an award-winning architect who has built a floating pier, which is on the waterfront in Hobart. And I got thinking about it and thought, well, that's perfect. We could actually have a floating pier, which could be solar powered, have batteries in the base that could desalinate water and run a hydroponics garden that actually can bring fresh water and fresh vegetables to quite large communities. So why wouldn't we marry that engineering and that architecture with what we know about the Pacific? So I've talked to him about it, he agrees, and so he and I are now on a mission to have one of these built and put somewhere in the Pacific to demonstrate that. And to that end, we've basically gone to the university and said a university should do more than monetize knowledge, which unfortunately a lot of these courses just do. This ought to be a social, you know, the sustainable development goals. If you're serious about sustainable development goals, serious about a climate emergency, serious about not working for climate wreckers, let's get in and talk to students about using their brains to actually address some of these crises. And so that's what we're doing. And just as we're doing that, the New Zealand government has just offered prizes for architecture students to come up with resilient built infrastructure in the Pacific. Fantastic. So it's great. People are actually starting to get the best brains in our young people and in universities at the moment to put them to the public interest and the public good. And that really excites me. I think, you know, I've been to enough global meetings. I know where that ends. It's important to have global frameworks, but we're actually now at the point where people either have to leave their homes or we help them stay where they are, whether it's Lismore or whether it's in the Pacific. And that's where we have to really put our minds in the short term while stopping them dig up and burn more.
Thank you, Christine. And as you're talking, like there's so many, obviously, hooray, Christine, various affirmations of you and your contribution just then. We have only got a few minutes left, and I just want to acknowledge the incredible contributions that you've all made in the chat and the questions about a range, like heaps of different issues. Of course, the health issue, you know, is something that we could have a completely different webinar on. I do want to just reassure, a lot of you have asked questions around, you know, different sustainability ideas in terms of cities and everything that we can do. I think that's we've been talking about doing another webinar, in fact, just addressing that in its the whole planning issues in New South Wales, which are massive, and I think we can get some experts in on that. So everybody that is tuned in today, you'll receive another email from me for this next webinar we'll do in that space. But I wanted to throw, so people are asking about deliberative democracy. Malcolm Robbins, the last question in the Q&A box, and other people have talked about it as well, that Australia seems to be experiencing terminal failure of representative democracy. Does the panel consider it possible to rescue politics from itself by transition to an alternative political model, such as deliberative democracy? If so, how? I'm going to go Christine, Scott, and then Naomi on this in terms of what that looks like for the last questions, I think, to be answered. So Christine. Yes, food security, so many things. Everybody's putting all this.
Yes, I'm just
we could have gone for 2-day conference on all of this.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I certainly agree that what we have at the moment is not participatory democracy, which is what we ought to be having. And for a long time, the idea of community forum or fora was ridiculed, but I think there is a substantial space for actually going and having the kind of conversations that you need to have in a structured way in communities. And it'll be great to start with Lismore, frankly. It's a huge problem there. Everybody is impacted by it. And given the mental health issues, given the poverty issues, given so many other issues because of it, that would be a great place to start, to have these proper community forums, which then flow into the policy process. But the best thing we can do is make sure we get multi-party representation in parliaments and end the two-party system. If we did that, as the Europeans have done, you would get much more engagement with the community. And we've made a start on that with the last election. And the great thing about the election of the independents is that it's legitimised the idea of multi-party government. When the Greens talked about it, it was, oh no, the green tail wagging the dog, etc. Now everyone thinks it's a marvellous idea, and I think it's a marvellous idea. So, well, good. We're all on the same page. Multi-party democracy and proper community structured conversations and consultations that feed into that, pretty much as the Voices movement has demonstrated is possible. I think as Greens we can combine those, and I think it's hopeful.
Thank you, Christine. And I read a comment out. Thank goodness from Kate Coxall. Thank goodness for Naomi and other community leaders who have picked up the pieces. Yes, Christine, we'll go to Naomi in a second. But Scott, you, deliberative democracy, alternative to, or the terminal failure of representative democracy, thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a lovely way to finish up, actually. I think like properly constituted deliberative democracy feels like a more evolved democratic practice than what we've got, these kind of captured Westminster structures that we're trying to deal with at the moment. I don't think it means abandoning what we have, and we've seen that we've been able to make such progress with the tools that we've got on the 21st and the work that you're doing in New South Wales with the team and elsewhere. But recognising their shortcomings, that they do things like they breed professional politicians, they're relatively easy to buy and capture, and they don't end up representing the collective will. And that's what democratic structures should do. Looking at the practice of deliberative democracy in places like Brazil, where they do participatory budgeting, where tens of thousands of local residents are involved in a large-scale practice of what John O'Shea is doing in Brisbane right now. It's like, give people their damn money and let them deliberatively choose what to do with it. Closer to home, I know it was a big political risk in South Australia, but they handballed that nuclear waste dump decision to a citizens' jury. Now, hundreds of people, none of them experts in this stuff. They gave them access to expertise and they could ask whatever questions they wanted, came up with something that, to the state government's credit, they ended up having to respect, which was, we do not want that here. So I think there's huge potential for it. And it's not as avant-garde as it sounds. This is also a very ancient form of decision-making. This is sitting down and listening to each other. It's what the Greens try to do. It's what traditional societies have done for tens of thousands of years. So we borrow a bit of the new and learn from the old, I think. So it's a great place to wind the conversation up.
Amazing, Scott. And that pivots to Naomi, and how do we ensure, or First Nations voices lead, what is everybody is talking about community being more involved in political decisions.
And again, just pointing out the obvious, but what we've actually just been talking about the past few minutes is, our systems of governing our own affairs and leading our own communities and leading that decision making. So, what what you're actually saying is certainly familiar to me in terms of how, Aboriginal communities and leadership and decision-making works, is that there's absolutely no hierarchy system. This is actually about acknowledging that, the ways of doing things prior to colonisation worked. And we're actually really progressive and certainly protected more than just land and country. So, for us as a community of people, an Indigenous community of people here in Lismore, the past 5 months, that's been our experience, is making sure that we're going back to, systems of leadership, that's served our communities and our people, and it's absolutely been and made the difference in terms of how we've been able to support our community. There is no hierarchy system on the ground, in Lismore here when we do what we do. Nobody is there with title. Everybody is there as an equal. Everybody's voice is just as important as the next person. What's extremely important is that we're listening to the people who have been impacted the most during this time. We're listening to their experiences, and whether it's a flood event, the bushfires, or the next natural disaster that will come due to this climate crisis, we have to make sure that we're continuing to listen to the voices of the people that have been impacted the most. And some of the conversations we've had tonight, there's been examples of how to do things better, and those countries that you speak of, they're Indigenous populated countries. So I think what we do need to acknowledge is that there's been systems around that have existed for over 60, 70, 80,000 years here in Australia and around the globe that have worked. And certainly having those conversations around the table by people who have that knowledge, who had the knowledge then and certainly have it now. I have a lot to learn. I certainly have a lot to learn. And this experience has certainly been a baptism by fire in terms of how to shift and adapt and be fluid with who we are as an organisation and how we support our communities. But I think what we've, acknowledged the most is that we come from a strong line of resilient people. We come from a strong line of ancestors and family members and community members that have survived. So certainly, when I speak passionately about this, it's different to the next person because of, where I come from and my community and, and my people in this country. But I just really hope, and if I can speak on behalf of our people, not just in Lismore, but around the nation, is that, our voices deserve to be heard. This is always about giving land back. This is always about acknowledging that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. This is about acknowledging that the systems and frameworks, whether it's infrastructure or whether it's how this country is being governed, has never worked. It's never served our people. And now we have large groups of peoples, whether it is, political parties like the Greens that acknowledge that this history and what has happened is why we are in this predicament that we are in now today. We have these people behind us ready to go to join our voices and to fight for us. Now it's about reaching out to the wider population to make them understand just how important their voices are to join us. Like I said, I think we do need more forums because we could certainly talk, in great length about this, but I think we're really desperate now. We need to desperately start trying to do the right thing, and that starts with listening.
Thank you, Naomi. They were wonderful words to end on. And I'm just like, as you're speaking, the chat box is just pouring in with people saying thank you so much. That we're needing to listen to Indigenous knowledge, and I'm just so glad you had in your very, very busy world right now, still dealing with the trauma, still working and assisting, helping your community, still being an incredible leader in the Northern Rivers and probably actually across the country. So thanks, Naomi. That's wonderful. And Christine and Scott, you're both awesome. The love is coming in for you both as well. And for all of you who joined tonight, clearly there is so much more of this discussion to have. I'm just sitting here going, okay, we need to do one on this. We need to do one on this. We need to have webinars for all of you because we have been through a hell of a lot, obviously, in the last you know, even 6 months here in New South Wales. And it's really clear that people are just wanting to talk about it. You're wanting to discuss it, wanting to have these forums are so important. So there will be more of them. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Our wonderful panel, everybody on the webinar is as a clapping. Thank you for all the work you continue to do, Scott, Christine, Naomi. You're all absolutely awesome. And thanks again. And yeah, I reckon we get you along for another thing at some point soon. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We're going to end the webinar now. Go and have dinner and enjoy your night. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks.